we need to move forward toward the future
Yeah.
because there will be, progress, but it's hardly not defined. What is the goal of this progress? Okay, is it material progress, and maybe we need another gadget in our home that makes it
Yeah,
really
exactly.
easy, that or is it social progress? Is it political? I mean, but if you really um, push these arguments, it all has to come back somehow into the question of human happiness,
Yeah.
and this was something that I really was interested in when I was in graduate school, in the lower levels of my graduate school, the idea of happiness and theories of happiness, and the fact that all people seem to be striving for happiness, and what is happiness and all of that. But basically there seems to be this faith. There's a faith that down the road things can be better. So in integral psychology, I think the calling is for the attainment or contact with the higher levels of consciousness, whether it's the spiritual or the soul deep within, and then bringing that consciousness, making it available to our ordinary existence in such a way that they can help us transform this ordinary existence. Now, not only this prepares us for even higher evolution of consciousness and further spiritual development, but it will also transform who we are in the world and the world that we're in.
Yeah.
And in fact, it will give a complete meaning to why we're in this world and why this whole setup was there to begin with, of us being souls that came down to this physical level, and now we're evolving, and so the why of all these things may become resolved. I would like to maybe start out by saying that um, from a personal point of view, this integral framework for psychology has really helped me put a lot of bits and pieces together. And I think this is one of the properties of what we call integral consciousness. And integral consciousness in the sense that some of the leading figures in this case, and of course, Sri Aurobindo and the mother uh, are very key people, but there are also maybe other people that have reached states of consciousness that what we call integrality, or higher levels of consciousness, in a way that it doesn't simply just transcend and go above and beyond where we are in this life, but it includes everything in a way that um, gives a certain sense of a unified sense of being, and a unified um, sense of um, uh, well, I would say maybe existence and its purpose, in a way that would be very difficult to find in many other bits and pieces that one learns in life, including some philosophies or schools of psychology or many other pieces of knowledge. Somehow it can help put it together. But I would say the key factor in this is the integration of our own personality, which is the key to this whole process.
Mm.
Because integral consciousness is something, let's say, I think this is not the best metaphor or example, but let's just put it this way to make it simple. If you have a jigsaw puzzle that has all these bits and pieces, and there's some vision, some picture that you're supposed to imagine and figure out that these pieces belong to that vision. Let's say that's a holistic vision, right? Because it's the whole of that picture. And then these bits and pieces are given to you, and you're trying to figure out how to put them together in a way that it would come up with that holistic vision. This is similar to that, in that the bits and pieces that we encounter is from our life experiences. And we experience everything through the lens of our personality. Personality is not just a theory. It's not just something that maybe a psychologist proposes, maybe creates a map of some sort, or says personality is composed of such and so X, Y, and Z. It's actually sort of a living, uh, evolving process. It's a developmental process, something that begins at birth and it moves on until the very end. It's always changing. It's good to remember that there's no fixed personality uh, image that what we can say, uh, for example, if we made an assessment of someone and said, okay, this is that person's personality in terms of this theory. Well, it can be something rather different tomorrow or a
Mm,
year from now, and it's so important because in our mental tendencies, we like to cling on to fixed images of sorts to give us a sense of stability and
mm,
a sense that we know something, whereas a lot of things are always changing. But this personality that we start out with, and I think in some of the earlier talks that we had together, there's hints about this as well. It's really not a cohesive, unified lens. It's something that emerges and evolves in bits and pieces. For example, one part of that process is the development of the physical body, the senses, the early 2, 3 years of life when the child begins to develop the body primarily in the brain. And then, when mobility begins and the child begins to sense that they have an agency, they have a willpower that they can, they exist and they can exert their power and their will, and then moves on to more mental levels of development. That goes on then throughout the rest of the life, from more concrete mental development to more abstract mental development, usually after the age of 10, 11, etc., more abstraction becomes possible. So all of this is something that is fragmented to begin with.
mm,
So in some sense, we can say uh, at least the way that we see our personality is quite partial because we only see a certain portion of this that we usually call the conscious aspect of our personality.
mm,
And typically, this is the lens that our ego has. And our ego basically is aware of certain things. Parts of it is the sort of interaction with the environment, the sensation and the perception. Part of it is the cognition, the thinking processes. And there are also other elements. There are things like dreams, there are intuitions. There are so many different elements to consciousness, but our ego usually comes up with a very limited perspective on things that leaves out quite a bit in the unconscious or subconscious realm. So that's another way that we can look at this fragmentation. A third way
yeah.
we can look at this fragmentation is dissociation, that uh, our personalities are not really just one one thing. It's not just like a whole cloth. It's not a whole fabric of sort. It has all these patches and bits and pieces. In fact, back in the beginning of the 20th century, William James suggested that our self structure may be thought of as having three different elements. That was what he called the material self, that has to do with our body, physical existence, and our belongings, even including our kin, our relatives, our children, our parents, everything that we think belongs to us in the material world. And then there's the social dimension of it, which has to do with the other people that we interact with. And then he also posited a spiritual dimension, so that these three levels started pretty much even before any formal theories of personality were posited by Freud and Jung and others, by the psychodynamic group. So from the very beginning, personality had that feature to it that it's composed of different aspects. But that kind of went out of fashion until Roberto Assagioli, a psychiatrist from Italy, came up with a theory of subpersonalities. He would look at how we interact with various groups of people and in different situations, and then he sensed that we often develop these aspects of our personality that are designed for interaction in a particular environment. For example, in our work environment, we might have a different face, we have a different facade, and in the family environment, we might have a different way of being in the world and with friends and in other situations, So there are all these different facets of personality, and that sometimes these developments are such that they're kind of dissociated from one another, as if, this person's work life and let's say
Yeah.
family life are just two different lines of development, and they all have their own, sort of um, aspects to it. And then somehow maybe one aspect is not quite aware of the other aspect. It only becomes aware when it shifts from one to the other. And so, even though other theories of personality often posit different aspects to personality, but it's usually thought of as something that is cohesive in some sense. But in reality, personality is more fragmented than cohesive. And then there are certain life experiences that can make this fragmentation even more diversified and take it to even extremes, in which case we have what's called a split personality or multiple personality disorder, right? So the idea of subpersonalities that Assagioli um, suggested, which is the basis of his personality theory, can be taken to extremes, and these personalities can become totally split from one another, and result in what we call multiple personality.
Yeah.
There's some interesting examples of that nowadays even on YouTube one can find, a lot of material on this. So I think our given assumption so far in Western psychology is that there's a great likelihood that our personality is fragmented. So, among these key philosophers and psychologists that we have covered in the past, especially Freud and Jung, and well, Jung and Assagioli, something of a, especially with Jung and Assagioli, they were very much interested in the spiritual dimension, in the soul dimension, whether they call it self or higher self or use the word soul, which they did. They were looking for a an aspect of personality, something in personality or something somewhere that could bring all these different parts and pieces together. And that's why Assagioli's work is known as psychosynthesis,
Yeah.
psychosynthesis, that is to sort of bring all these aspects together. And also Jung's work resulted in the idea of what he called the wholeness of personality through integration of ego and self. This idea that all these different aspects of personality that he had in mind, like the shadow, the archetypes, the ego, all these different aspects need to be brought together. And the question was, how does this come together? And, so this was an interesting quest that evolved out of the transpersonal aspect of psychodynamic theory through Jung and Assagioli. Now, in the East, uh, pretty much at the same time, the first part of the 20th century, Sri Aurobindo was talking about very similar things, and he was talking about it from a yogic perspective, not from a psychological theory perspective. He didn't necessarily see clients and observe, clinical
Well, in a
observation.
certain sense, he had an entire ashram, no, with a lot of people. So it was not clients, but
Yes, I
in a
mean, he
sense,
definitely had a great insight into
mm,
how human consciousness works, but I believe that a lot of that was based on his own experiences
yeah,
and looking at
pretty
himself
different.
and
Yeah,
seeing these things in yourself, and then that's a good basis. When once we begin to see something in ourselves, it becomes a lot easier to see it in others.
yeah,
So he also was basically talking about our many selves. Yeah, Dr. Dalal, A.S. Dalal, put a compilation of all the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, all what they said about uh, personality and its fragmentation in a book called uh, Our Many Selves, which I mentioned before. But this book is really interesting because it pretty much gets at this very same point that our personality is just something of a hodgepodge, really.
yeah,
Sri Aurobindo has said this on different occasions that there are these different elements of our personality that are often not only unaware of each other, but they're also at conflict with one another. So, for example, we talked about personality in integral psychology could be looked at having a triple ego formation, a physical ego, a vital ego, and a mental ego. And that these three egos, these are three centers of organization. They're not necessarily three different things that are out there, but they're actually organization principles of different aspects of the same person. So, we have these things that are often at odds with one another, and they strive to get a hold of the agency of volition, to get the reins in their hand. The vital ego, for example, is interested in vital experiences, in desires, in fulfillment of desires, in exertion of power, for example, and all of that.
yeah,
And so, it tries to, get a hold of the reins through, usurpation of, the willpower. Same with other dimensions, they're all always competing. And as we also said before, each person's personality is dominant usually in one aspect and less dominant in others. For example, some are more mental oriented,
mm,
some are more vital
mm,
oriented, some are more physical oriented. Actually, it's interesting that in some earlier Western personality theories, we had, for example, the theories of the three body types, that were called ectomorph, mesomorph, and endomorph, and these were actually pretty much, if you look at it, it wasn't said in this context, but if you look at it in retrospect, you can see that. Yes, one of them is the thinking type, one of them is the athletic type, the mesomorph is the athletic type, and then the other one is the more physical. And it corresponds almost similarly to the,
mm,
tamasic, rajasic, and sattvic gunas
yeah,
in Indian psychology. So we have these elements. So the question is, which of these theories do you want to use? Do you want to utilize? And I think in integral psychology, as a integral philosophy, multi-perspectivism or multi-perspectivalism is something that it should be the nature of things, that we shouldn't have just one lens for looking at things. So it is possible within the framework, the more loose framework of integral psychology, to adopt any one of these theories and work with it, depending on the application and how it might work. For example, if the gunas help you understand someone, you can analyze them in terms of the three gunas. If it helps to look at their body types in terms of ectomorph, endomorph, and mesomorph, you can bring that in. Or if you can use Assagioli's theory of subpersonalities, that's helpful, or Jung's, etc. Or you can use, the material that your Aurobindo has given us. So some of these theories have more applied teachings, and some of them have more theoretical teachings, but they're all potentially useful. But what's really interesting to me is that all of them are talking about these multiplicity and multidimensionalities of aspects of personality.
Yeah.
And the big question has always been, what can unify all these diversified energies and elements? And it turns out, and I'll stop after this so we can maybe have a pause in a conversation, that the answer becomes the soul that, or the self, we can use them interchangeably for this conversation, that we can use, we can posit a center of personality, which is probably not in the same field that other aspects of personality are, but something maybe over and above or below or beyond somehow these elements that can potentially bring these together. And in Sri Aurobindo, in integral psychology of Sri Aurobindo, that has come to be named the psychic being. And, so Jung talked about soul, Roberta Assagioli talked about the higher self or the transpersonal self. So this is very interesting development. I think after all these different theories of personality and different philosophies and all the bits and pieces that we've had, I think we're arriving at almost a very, interesting conjunction here where we can see and say with confidence that human personality is in the process of evolution from fragmentation to wholeness.
Yeah. I like this very much because you gave a summary of a very complex argument, a very complex theory, quite in a quite clearly arranged way. I see the whole picture of all what you said. But to make it easier, perhaps for those who never have had any contact with integral psychology, integral yoga, and so on, let me make also perhaps some examples from my personal experience, from in the everyday life, for example. One of the things that came up immediately to my mind when you were speaking, when you speak about these different aspects of personality, difference of the fragmentation of this personality, was my experience in when I was working in a certain environment and with the leading figures, the boss, my boss, who more than once I could see this, who are very often, I don't want to generalize this, but it happens, that you can find people who are in a leading position and that treat their employees, can we say, the employee rudely, aggressively, in a mean way. They're really very mean, and they treat them, the subordinates like slaves, more or less. And you have a very, very negative impression. You say, this is a really evil person. And then this happens more than once. I saw this. Their children come to visit them in their office, so I'm also present. And they suddenly become
Loving.
sweet-hearted, lovingly, And you say, this is the sweetest person that exists in the world. Yeah. So you can see that some people adopt a certain personality in a certain environment, but then when they are home, they really love their children, they transform themselves. This is, by the way, also historically, this has been observed also during the German Nazi period, where Nazis, for example, Mengele, Mengele was a doctor who made his experiments on Jewish children and so, and horrible things. But there are a lot of historical accounts that tell how he loved his children and his dog. Yeah, yeah. He would never have done these things to it. So I sometimes ask myself, how can someone be so completely different only by changing the context where you live or where you work? This is a kind of change of personality at the same time. But this is already something that we can see already at a more or less superficial level. There are also then other types of personalities or fragmentation of personalities that you already mentioned. This is a multiple or split personality. And as you said, you can find this on YouTube. There are these dissociative disorder people who really identify with, they say that they are the two persons in the same body. Yeah. So also from the metaphysical point of view, I'm wondering if this is a fragmentation of personality, or eventually if these are really two souls in the same body that switch the position, so to speak, and take the lead externally. This is also something really puzzling for me. Then we should never forget, now it was once in fashion. Now seems to be no longer a topic of discussion in psychology and in the consciousness studies. But then there is these cases of that is no longer so in fashion nowadays, but it was at times of Shirazi, it was hypnosis. When you I am not an expert. I know nothing about this, but I don't know how you do this. But you can hypnotize people, or at least some subjects are open themselves to hypnosis, and they transcend and go into some sort of state of consciousness that I don't know exactly what. I think this is subliminal. I think in the subliminal, where you have you are aware, you are conscious, but in a completely different manner. And again, there you have a completely different personality. What is that? Yeah. So who are we really? Yeah. Because at the end, the question is, who am I? I'm this or that personality, a mix of these, but there is a loss of identity once you become conscious of all these aspects. Yeah. And then another example that came to my mind now, yeah, but generally speaking, we are not really aware of the wholeness of all these different fragmented parts that constitute of our personality. And it maybe the first thing that I feel is lacking today is not so much that we become all yogis and I become conscious of all these aspects of my life. This is a bit too far-fetched, and this is probably something too difficult and too far for the ordinary conscious mind to get there. But at least know that we don't know. Know that we are different parts, and we are guided by these subconscious or subliminal or what? Or from the soul. What comes from the soul? What comes from the subconscious? What comes from the subliminal? And so on. That we understand, that we are continuously dominated by these different personalities, and the most important aspect is to recognize that we are not neither this nor that personality. And I often try to explain this to people, but yeah, it's difficult. I think we need a psychology that goes beyond this, and you put at the center now the soul. Yeah, so this was a bit my consideration. There's no direct question that I maybe you have something to say about this, what I just said. No?
Well, yeah, I think, you gave more examples of how this can be uh, seen in actual life. And what I would add to that is that from a subjective perspective, this lack of cohesiveness creates a kind of a vacuum, that makes the quest for wholeness a very important motivation in integral psychology. And there's even a metaphysical background to this that you can tie it all together, and maybe I'll go into that a little bit. Um, the quest for wholeness, in each theory of personality, there seems to be ideas about what motivates a human being. For example, Freud started out with positing that sexual energy and sexuality has a lot to do with it, and these theories were novel, and they apply in some cases. And there's some relative and some historical validity to what he started as as a discussion. But the idea was sexual energy is very important. So, we live for that, and let's say Alfred Adler came in. He, if I remember correctly, when he was a young boy, he felt a lot of domination. Maybe, if I remember this correctly, he had a bigger brother who dominated him a lot, and he his experience was one of being dominated by this bigger brother, and maybe other people too. So he ended up positing that quest for power is the dominant motive in a human being, and this goes back to people like Nietzsche as well, um, philosophers like Nietzsche, and so on and so forth. So we can say, or later on, other humanist psychologists came in. Maslow, for example, start to posit, things like quest for self-actualization. Transpersonal psychology came in, borrowing from Eastern and other mystical traditions. I brought up the idea of quest for self-realization, something even beyond psychology, something that's totally transcendent, and so on. So as you can see, the different schools of psychology all have that. And for integral psychology, quest for wholeness is the key. For me, it explains why we continue to live at the edge of the evolutionary wave that Sri Aurobindo has described. We humans are at the crest of the evolutionary wave. Why are we so motivated to move on, to march forward? Not even most human beings necessarily, not even all human beings have theory of evolution in their mind. I mean, there are so many religious people with different ideas, and so many different stories about who we are and creation and all of that. And not all of it is necessarily about evolution or evolution of consciousness. But somehow humanity, regardless, is moving forward, is driven by instincts that are very strong, instincts of reproduction and survival, aggression and self-preservation and things of that nature. And but I would add to these classical instincts, which basically come down to these that I mentioned. There's and these are instincts are basically unconscious, right? So in psychodynamic theory, instincts are posited as ways that we naturally know how to do something without having to learn them or without knowing how we know them, So an animal, for example, can give birth to offsprings and can take care of them and feed them and love them and all of that. Somehow this knowledge is in this animal. And so the same way human beings have this. The only thing is that we've evolved to a more mental level of consciousness where our um, our instincts have become more mentally conscious. We've been able to reflect more and more on these things, whether through psychological theory or philosophy or through day-to-day life. And so we have become more conscious in the development of our instincts. But I would add to these classical instincts of aggression and self-preservation and sex, reproduction instincts. I would also add a class called metaphysical instincts, something that drives us toward a higher purpose.
Mm.
And this instinct, this is a term that I came up with, and it's not something that there's a lot written about, but I would describe it as um, the spiritual instinct or the religious instinct. It takes a religious form in the earlier stages of its development. Um, it involves belief systems on the mental level, myths and beliefs and things of that sort. It involves rituals, and other aspects that we usually tend to know religion. We tend to associate with religion, But eventually, in the evolution of this a person, this instinct also becomes more conscious, and that's where I would say this is where spiritual awakening happens, and this is where yoga or spiritual practice happens. So this is where our metaphysical instinct becomes more conscious, and so I think this quest for wholeness is a quest that is driven by the soul because our soul, according to the theories of, let's say, Indian psychology or even integral psychology, the soul comes from a higher, more unified state of consciousness we call Atman, which is one with the universal consciousness, transcendent consciousness as well. So this Atman or Brahman gives birth to an individualized version of the soul that comes down into this physical level and evolves up through these higher levels of vital and mental, and then beyond the mental, and eventually captures this wholeness. So our quest, I would say, according to an interpretation, at least one interpretation in integral psychology, is quest for embodied wholeness. And the key word here is embodied wholeness, because our soul knows wholeness. It is from that same fabric. The soul, according to Sri Aurobindo, is a portion of the divine. It's a portion of universal consciousness. It is born out of the transcendent consciousness. And for that reason, it has the divine qualities and it has wholeness in it. But this wholeness needs to be unfolded and expressed and captured, recaptured at the embodied level. And I would say that in integral psychology, we can look at the process of evolution of consciousness as a quest for wholeness uh, through the process of embodiment and capturing all the higher levels of consciousness and then, becoming whole. And I think that to me, this explains why we move on on this evolutionary march. We are looking for this. I think there are many ideas about why human beings progress into the future. Usually we think of it as, I mean, it's really vague. I don't even know if there are that many theories in philosophy about why we're moving forward into the future, why we don't.
A philosopher would immediately reply, what means forward, what means progress? This is just a distinction we shouldn't make. There is no progress. We are not getting from worse to better, from bad to good. Quite the contrary, just look what the news are. Just see what is happening in the world and so on. You see, we are always the same. There is no progress, period. So the problem is solved. There is no
Yes.
something that goes towards the future other than in the
Yes.
sense. Yeah.
Yes, I think
We reply.
the philosophy or the philosopher who brings in the mind into this picture can make it complicated, like you're saying.
But it is an argument. It's not easy
Yes,
to. I don't agree with this point of view, but it is not that easy to deconstruct such kind of objections that I come up with this now because I get this objection continuously, always, permanently, especially when I take this Aurobindonian perspective. Sometimes I mention him explicitly, sometimes not, but I take this perspective where I say we are developing, we are progressing. There is a sort of progress, which is not just the scientific technological progress. There is also spiritual progress. But I think that the materialist, the physicalist, or the skeptic generally has an argument in saying, we don't have this impression that we are getting better as a species. Quite the contrary. One can come up with arguments that shows that we are getting worse. Look what is happening. So
yes, yeah. I mean, there are a diversity of positions that philosophers have taken. And at the same time, though, Marco, the one of the hallmarks of modernism is this idea of progress, which probably was maybe it started with the Renaissance and the idea of physical and scientific progress,
yeah,
and the idea that science can give us so many things, even if we don't know something now, we can know it in the future. And I think there's a lot of that instinctually. Again, like I say, maybe they don't philosophize about it, maybe they don't talk about it so much, but they're acting as if we need to move forward toward the future
yeah,
because there will be, progress, but it's hardly not defined. What is the goal of this progress? Okay, is it material progress, and maybe we need another gadget in our home that makes
yeah,
it really
exactly.
easy, that or is it social progress? Is it political? I mean, but if you really um, push these arguments, it all has to come back somehow into the question of human happiness,
Yeah,
and this was something that I really was interested in when I was in graduate school, in the lower levels of my graduate school, the idea of happiness and theories of happiness, and the fact that all people seem to be striving for happiness, and what is happiness and all of that. But basically there seems to be this faith. There's a faith that down the road things can be better,
yeah,
and the only thing that makes us pause and think about that is all the problems that we have, right? So in the past, I remember in the 60s and 70s, if you watched nature programs on television. It was all goody, nice things. It was about how beautiful nature is, how beautiful animals are, and so on and so forth. Now there's hardly any of that kind of program that you can watch that is not a warning about how everything is going down the tubes and how there is a crisis of this kind and that kind, and how this animal species is disappearing, and how that ecology is getting devastated. And so the narrative has changed in the past 20 to 30 years, and that change in narrative has put a dent into this myth of progress. And that makes us pause. I think in the 21st century, legitimately, some of the
Yeah.
philosophers like you have talked about have started to question,
Yeah.
but the bulk of humanity is moving towards something, and it's not really, for some people it's actually dying and going to heaven, right? I mean, that's still very strong, in so
Yeah.
many religious people.
Yeah.
The idea is that you cannot attain happiness in this life, and it has to be found in afterlife, and the materialist, I think, depends on who they are. If they're pessimist, they're more into the sort of randomness of everything and the meaninglessness of everything.
Yeah.
That sort of undertone becomes more apparent. Or they're positive oriented and hope oriented and future, I don't know, maybe sci-fi,
Yeah. This
kinds
is
of
very
thing,
in
all
fashion
those.
today. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, but to me, what I think I have settled in for now in terms of how I understand integral psychology is that there's a hunger in all of us. And I
Mhm.
would say this hunger is a sense of wholeness. That's what we're looking for. And I
Yeah.
think in some of us, if not all children, I could not say for all children, but in some children, there's something of a sense of wholeness in the earlier years of life. There's a sense of joy. There's a sense of sort of a kind of a divine existence, which is soon wiped out
Mm.
and deconstructed or covered up with our education system and our sort of existential orientation toward life as most people think it should be, and closing down all those channels. But I think in some of us, there's still that sense alive, and we're looking for that. And for many people, I think, I for a moment I can put all the scientists and philosophers in one category, or once put them on one side. But there's also a lot of spiritual people
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
more or less are looking for things of this sort, that there are,
Uh, I was
Buddhists.
just making an example of, but they are actually, I don't have statistics, I cannot, but from my personal experience, they are a majority. Maybe this will change with time, but as you say, there is this also this point of view of the materialist that says the universe has no meaning. It's only our imagination, because it's an anthropomorphic instinct to believe that the universe has any meaning. It's just as it is. It came out of whatever random mutation or random phenomena, whatever. And we should not even begin with these kind of questions. The interesting is how there is also this instinct to crash down every desire to ask this question. We should not ask this question. There is no meaning, there is no purpose, there is no telos, there's nothing. And with this kind of ideology in the background, when you come to these psychological aspects, you also say, no, there is no progress. It's Darwinian evolution. We already said that in our last conversations. Darwinian evolution is just about change. There is nothing that becomes better, evolves. But okay, this is, however, another aspect. But I think the one way to get near to this is also to become aware of our own parts and planes and parts of these fragmented personalities in ourselves. No?
Yes, that is exactly, I think the key to any worldview
Yeah.
is the understanding of the personality that produces that worldview.
Because nowadays we don't know ourselves. That's the problem. We are not even educated, neither in the
No,
schools, nor in science, nor in the family, to know ourselves. It's all about knowledge external to us, or
of,
knowledge in
of,
books,
of things.
yeah, of
Yes.
things,
Yeah.
or abstract concepts in books and so
Yes.
on. But
Yes.
the
Yes.
knowledge of how these different personalities, yeah, to a large degree dominate us, because this is, after all, the conclusion, the distressing conclusion one reaches once one has seen all these interrelated parts of us and how they impel us to do things, sometimes also that we don't want to do, but then when you begin to know yourself, then you can understand also this integral psychology, this line of reasoning that you make about the fragmentation of personalities much better. And you can also begin to understand this strange phenomenon. Let me just cite a couple of few that came to my mind, because I find these absolutely fascinating. I don't know if you have ever heard about twilight anesthesia. It's a kind of anesthesia where you don't it's you don't lose your consciousness, yeah, because, by the way, how do we know that we lose our consciousness under full anesthesia? We cannot really say that, but you assume that if you don't know yourself, because when we sleep, for example, we are already in another state of consciousness. We cannot say really we have lost consciousness. We are another state of consciousness. And even in the so-called deep sleep, who knows, from the external point of view, we should be agnostic. But no, you have lost consciousness. But in any case, this is, again, something else. In the twilight anesthesia, you don't lose, so to speak, consciousness. You are still conscious. You speak with people, do things. You have still a relatively good understanding of the environment. You can think and talk also with other people in a very rational manner. But then when this anesthesia goes away, you turn back to your own real ordinary personality and have completely forgotten what you have said during this twilight anesthesia. And you can see yourself in the video and say, no, that cannot be me. Something like that. It's like a sleepwalking state. Also, sleepwalking. What is sleepwalking?
Yeah.
What is that really? Are
Yes.
we really unconscious? I don't know if these stories are true or not, but the people talk about people that in a state of sleepwalking were driving cars.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
at least, they speak of a case of someone who drove a car, killed someone, drove back, go returned into his bed, was asleep, woke up, forgot everything. Yeah. I don't know if this is really true, but it seems that these kind of, for sure, we know that there are sleepwalking states where you don't remember, and there are people who go to the fridge and begin to
Yeah.
eat or
That's
cook something.
quite common. Yeah. Yeah. I
But
mean,
what
not for
is this
everyone, but
really? Yeah. Let's understand that this does not mean that we are unconscious, but there is something that takes control of our personality that we forget, but it is another personality. It is someone's, it's not us really, because we ultimately are a soul, the psychic being, ultimately what's real nature is that, but we are dominated not only by our waking personality, but also by other personality that we forget. Yeah?
Yeah.
Let's get into this understanding of ourselves. Then all these things that you have said acquire a much deeper significance, and there emerges something that's previously seemed to be only purely theoretical, and but here in this context suddenly makes much more sense.
Yes,
Would you
yes.
agree?
Yeah, I think, well, definitely, I agree that self-knowledge is kind of a taboo in
Yeah.
ordinary human consciousness, and I think there are reasons for that. It's egoic defense against the unknown, and the self that we want to know, it has usually dimensions that are in the unconscious or below the range of consciousness, and some of it is above the range of consciousness, but they're still unconscious. And going into these realms, whether it's the lower levels of deep unconsciousness or higher levels of spirit or whatever it is, these are terrifying potentially
Mm.
to people. Some people experiment with these things, but most people are very afraid of going into that. So there's that taboo, and spiritual practice often calls for self-knowledge. I mean, in India for forever has been Atmanam Vidhi, right? Know yourself, know Atman, know your soul. And many teachers like Sri Ramana Maharshi have been basically teaching that as the primary tool. And it's part of, many traditions that I know, in Buddhism and Sufism, and I think in many, I mean, all mystical traditions are basically about self-knowledge and self-discovery. But the bulk of humanity is not interested in that, or is guarded and defended. And that's exactly the key. Um, I have a feeling that there's some wisdom in nature about this, that
Yeah.
um, it's a process that has to happen individual by individual. It's not something that can happen en masse. There's no way to all of a sudden have everybody know themselves, because the lower order of the world as we know it will be totally disrupted, and so that would be something that requires um, something, of a, maintenance and gradual changes, but at the same time, any individual who's ready to become more conscious in terms of the instincts of the metaphysical instincts will go on the spiritual path. So I think some, schools of mysticism have talked about that before. But the question is, can we afford that kind of a model now in this day and age where everything is under threat, including our entire planetary existence? And I think Sri Aurobindo's answer to that would have been something like, no, we can no longer afford to just have individual soul salvation, right? Or soul realization, self-realization. That was possible always and still is possible, but we need ways of having more and more souls joining and changing the order of things, because we're at a critical juncture. And so, that changes in integral psychology, and we have to sort of look at possibilities of transformation. The transformation that we've talked about, all the different aspects of transformation, is really about, again, uh, getting these pieces of personality ready so they can be unified. So when we talk about, for example, transformation of the mental aspect, and then the vital aspect, and then potentially the physical aspect, it's because it's not enough to just transform the mental because the other parts, the vital and the physical, will be in contradiction to that. They will resist, they will oppose. And so you need to do the whole thing. It has to be done within a process. So, all that transformation is in the service of this unification. And the unification, the agency for unification is the soul. And I think this is really something to continuously remember. The soul has the blueprint for our evolution of consciousness. It does not have any particular way of interfering with the physical, mental, and vital development, but it has instrumentation that can be utilized for its catalytic function, for it to function as a catalyst for this transformation. And so we need to prepare these instruments. We have to prepare our egoic dimensions for this transformation. And once the soul takes over in the sense of remember that passenger in the back of a taxi and the driver in the front of a taxi. When the driver begins to cooperate with the passenger and gets the directions where we need to go, then it goes in a whole new level of development. And I think that level of development is hardly researched in developmental psychology. The only person that I know of is Elisabeth Teklinski, who's recently written about how we go beyond the formal stages of development in Western theory of personality development, and she brings in the idea of a soul and psychic being from Sri Aurobindo's psychology, but basically I think this is a whole area of future development and hopefully research and hopefully interest. I think that uh, it is very difficult to expect that these kinds of ideas will be accepted by um, all kinds of people because I think it's very obvious that humanity is mostly functioning from an egoic perspective. Everybody is out for their self-interest, the material self, self-preservation, I don't know, financial security or other types of things, pleasure seeking, vital adventures, power, and all these things that go with that. And a lot of our social development has been compromised in the service of this material development. Our politics, our society, everything has become under dominance of self-interest, and all this fragmentation that we see now in, political groups and all these things that are happening in the US and much of the world are basically because uh, proper social development is now being totally ignored. It's all in the service of self and material development, and let alone spiritual development. That has been basically kept to a minimal percentage of all humanity, and the rest of it is still in this unconscious, more or less religious expression that even that has been totally usurped by material self-interest and so on. So it's very difficult to I think expect that a lot of people uh, 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 will be joining this kind of psychology and this kind of future evolution of humanity. But at the same time, as many people, even small groups, it counts quite a bit because as we know, it's unfortunate, but unconsciousness and unconscious living leads to an unconscious death. And so a lot of humanity will be born and will not be introduced to these things or will not take interest to these things and will die. But we can count on what remains and what moves on into the future in terms of that particular percentage of humanity that's aware and awake. And I see a lot of science today, Marco, in the new generations. I think there's something in the air that I'm not sure exactly how to interpret or what to attribute it to, but I think in recent decades there is an emergent sense of importance of spiritual development. I
Yeah.
see so many programs on television now that are hinting at these, even on the evening news. You see bits and pieces of things that talk about spirituality as if, yeah, it's just another thing, that
Yeah.
that they would never talk about before. So I think there's just a lot of hope that there will be a certain group of people, and the good thing about human soul evolution, as we know in Sri Aurobindo's teachings, the mother's teachings, is that
Mm.
if we evolve our souls, our psychic being, our psychic entity, to higher and higher levels, the qualities that we develop, these psychic qualities that we develop, they can remain with us and we can take them with us into the future. Whereas those things that, those who do not accumulate these kinds of higher qualities, at death, we disintegrate and our physical bodies goes to the physical world and our vital disintegrates into the vital world and the mental also. And we become reconstituted, as they say, through reincarnation, again, back into this instinctual lap of Prakriti, Mother Nature.
Yeah.
We will start again. So we all will have these chances, but I think I see some signs of hopefulness that the more this critical mass of awakened people increases, that the more impact it has on others and on other souls. So, um, save all the interference of negative and adverse forces that are in the way of human evolution, there should be plenty of hope for the future.
Yeah. So let me see this all again from another perspective. So you say something, I try to reformulate it from my perspective, which is in line with yours, but I always see different things from an. So you say, yes, I agree with you that we are still not there yet. Humanity is still fixed on this self-centered materialistic paradigm where everything is at the service of a material gain, and this idea of the soul in psychology is almost inexistent, or if it is there, it is left aside as something secondary. Yet I think we can at least do something. Our discussion here is something like that, that we can leave a message in a bottle, so to speak, and say, hey, there is a central entity, there's a psychic being, that if you leave it out of the equation, you will always find yourself in a paradigm that leads or to self-contradictions or to inconsistencies, or you will always have the feeling that something is missing. Yeah. You have to wake up and realize, and I'm not speaking waking up, having great transcendent experiences, mystical experiences. I just wake up in a blunt, in its blunt meaning, realize that psychology needs to add into the picture also the central entity, which is the soul, and that has always been neglected. And it's time to consider it. Yeah? So this is a message that we send to every psychologist. I'm not a psychologist, but you are. And I was really absolutely fascinated because you just mentioned Elisabeth Teklinski, who wrote, and I think you, her supervisor, is it right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And let me just mention this. The thesis is entitled "A Matter of Heart and Soul Towards an Integral Psychology Framework for Post-Conventional Development" by Elisabeth Marie Teklinski. This was one of the finest presentation of how psychology is missing something fundamental that I read. I had also a conversation with her online with a Zoom, but unfortunately, it was a very personal conversation and I didn't record it, and it's a pity. Otherwise, maybe eventually we can do also a conversation with her eventually if you're interested. This is the central focus point, and not only in psychology, perhaps also in spirituality. And what is missing here, again, I repeat myself a bit, but I think it's extremely important, is the evolutionary aspect. It's not just a static soul that, yeah, okay, I'm a soul, and when I'm dead, my soul will go to heaven or to hell or whatever. There is a soul that evolves. And we should widen our perspective and see things integrally, means to see also how one is a reflection of the other. There's this physical evolution and there is a soul evolution. If we see things from this perspective, a lot of things that previously left myself at least with a lot of open questions now begin to make a lot of sense. But as you said, there is a resistance to go into this direction because one thing is also to know ourselves, to at least begin to know, to learn to know ourselves. And you say there's a resistance. Another thing that I would add is the cause of this resistance is that when you begin this journey, you will also discover things of yourself that you don't like. Yeah? There's this dark side of ourselves that yeah, we prefer not to know, and we prefer not to acknowledge that there is something dark in us. However, I saw a lot of people who acknowledge this, and I'm not sure that they are going the right direction, because there is, for them, integrating in the modern, at least I'm not in this New Age movement, but from what I can see in this New Age movement, or call it spiritual movement of the modern society, that mainly I can observe from YouTube and podcasts of other people's, they speak of the integration of this dark aspect, this dark side of ourselves, just to use a terminology, a Star Wars terminology. The dark side of us should be integrated. What they mean usually is to give it a free pass, to give it all, well, don't repress it, then give it. This is not exactly what integral yoga means. Integral yoga means become aware of this dark side, integrate it, yes, but integration means, first of all, transformation. It is a transformation of this lower instincts. And another thing that we have a problem with, especially I think in the Christian culture, to accept that after all we are animals. We are more, perhaps it's true, there's some aspects that are exceptional in a human being. We have built culture, we sent rockets into space, we can build sophisticated tools, technology, science, whatever. But at the end, we are still in our animal instinctive mode, yeah? And we have to discover this metaphysical instinct that you call it metaphysical instinct, which is in a certain sense the opposite of the lower instincts of the animal. No? So just I show also I don't know if this is visible. I think, I'm sorry that now it's the focus mode in the background. This is your article I just cited, Ben. The metaphysical instincts and spiritual bypassing in integral psychology. Yeah. It's your article on the Integral Review, September 2013, volume 9, number 3. Yeah? So that those who are listening know about this, and that eventually, if they are interested, they can go into the details. But this integration of the dark side needs our ability to make this, to become aware, so to develop this metaphysical instinct, become aware of this dark side, and then transform it. Yeah. It's not giving it a free pass whenever we wish.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I would put that um, in this way that a lot of probably a lot of historical attempts for spiritual development that is dealing with this metaphysical instinct has been at the expense of suppressing the biological instincts,
Yeah.
right? Uh, Typically, when you go to a monastic setting or, spiritual community, there are rules about sexuality, there are rules about, I mean, there's all kinds of guidelines and rules, and you avoid what's called the world of senses and the pleasures and sexuality and many different things. And the idea is that you need to get in touch with the higher
Yeah.
self, and that's very promising because much of our suffering is not because of the higher self, it's because of our lower self,
Yeah.
the unconscious, the instincts that have caused us to act in such a way that has brought back results that are harming us in so many different ways, personal, collective. And so we want a way out of that suffering. And so, but the problem is that if you have a framework that says you need to bypass dealing with the embodied self, which is, has as part of it these instincts of the lower instincts, but at the same time, there are many other aspects of this embodied self. If we are going to bypass, for example, emotions, right? All of our emotions, we can go into a state of meditation through well-known methods of practice of concentration and
Yeah.
dhyana and
Yeah.
totally become unaware of our body.
That's it.
Just like you said, in dream, we can go into a state that we're totally unaware of so many things, but we're still in a state of consciousness. We can go to those states of consciousness, but Sri Aurobindo warned us against that kind of approach because, well, it is possible, while it is possible to do that, but the rest of our being, it stays in this undeveloped way that it is right now. And, we can stay in those states for a while, but we have to come back again and again and live in our typical normal self. And then we encounter so many other issues. In fact, some of our problems become exaggerated once we have developed spiritually to some extent, but not integrally,
Yeah.
not completely. So I think this problem of bypassing the body and the emotions and not dealing with unconscious instincts that have to do with these things, will cause another issue and will cause a whole set of new problems for us. So that's why I think that as I see it today, in one sense, normal human development is driven, or if you even say progress or even evolution, for the most part, it's driven by these instincts of self-preservation and reproduction and just, going on, not knowing why and for what ultimate purpose for the most part, or we can create stories about that. And then some others have become tired of these unconscious ways and have gone on the spiritual paths, but many have also decided to sort of ignore these levels of consciousness and sort of. So in integral psychology, I think the calling is for the attainment or contact with the higher levels of consciousness, whether it's the spiritual or the soul deep within, and then bringing that consciousness, making it available to our ordinary existence in such a way that they can help us transform this ordinary existence. Now, not only this prepares us for even higher evolution of consciousness and further spiritual development, but it will also transform who we are in the world and the world that we're in.
Yeah.
And in fact, it will give a complete meaning to why we're in this world and why this whole setup was there to begin with, of us being souls that came down to this physical level, and now we're evolving, and so the why of all these things may become resolved. But one last little thing I would say in this context, and I'll pass it back to you, is that I think it's good to remember that these things, a lot of what we create is our mental ideas and so on. I remember very well, and it's stuck with me, when Haridas Chaudhuri, who was the person who brought Sri Aurobindo's teachings to the US, he shared about an experience that he had when he was 14 years old. And his experience was one of what he called a great silence. And he described that as the complete disappearance of mental consciousness for a while. That lasted up to about a week. And the interesting thing that he said about that was that all of my questions disappeared. You see, it's so interesting. Yes, we think that all these questions that we have are somehow uh, in the fabric of all reality, and we have to solve all these problems so that we can know reality, right? Whether it's science or otherwise, but these problems are created by the consciousness that we're in, the mental consciousness, the fragmentary nature of mental consciousness that we're in. So this fragmentation is not only at the personality level, but also the mental level of it in itself is just fragmentary by nature. So we're creating so many questions and so many puzzles and so many mysteries only because we're operating from this mind. So the idea is to somehow access this, you know, uh, psychic consciousness where we can actually perhaps even bypass these questions for a while and just let them be and just find that new consciousness that I think most human beings will be delighted to experience that because we have an instinct for it. We have some intuitions about it. We want that. We are all driven toward a better future because we somehow feel that there's something in store for us, that there's something awaiting, and that consciousness is what it is, I think. We if we access that in itself is such a great experience, but then at the same time, it can really help us reckon with this world and with all the problems that we have. So many of these problems that we have created, all the things that we see in the news today, from atomic threat of mutual self-destruction to some of the other problems I've recently read, one of your articles, for example, overpopulation is something that is totally being ignored for some reason. Like everybody's trying to solve all these problems in these little ways, and nobody is talking about just the massive overconsumption that's been created by this. That's a major factor here. And so, overpopulation, threat of mutual self-destruction, and all these environmental and atmospheric and so many other. I mean, these are all the results of human mental consciousness, but not the good part of the mental consciousness. The intentions may have been good in every single development, whether scientific or otherwise, but it has turned to its opposite, in practice. So I think the idea of transcending this mental consciousness for a deeper psychic consciousness is key because in a sense, not only when the mind isn't there, our mental questions won't be there, but when the mind is put out of operation in the way it's functioning now, all these problems will not be there either. You see, it's like you can solve these problems, but you can also prevent all these problems, right? One of the best ways
Yeah,
to prevent all these
prevent
problems
them.
is
Yeah.
to go into a higher levels of consciousness, is for us to evolve, to make all of our instincts conscious. We need to become conscious of what we eat. We need to become conscious of why and how we enter any relationship. All these instincts, need to be I mean, human reproduction seems to be almost entirely on an instinctual level. We're just reproducing ourselves and I don't know, was it a biblical mandate that we have to go forth and prosper? And so we're going forth,
Yeah.
but we're not prospering. So we need to become conscious of these instincts and know exactly what we want to do. And so, I mean, all the issues that you mentioned in your articles, depletion of so many resources and all that, I think this all can be prevented if we have a different consciousness that sees the whole picture
Mm.
and it can actually lay the way for our future as well.
Yeah, you know what? The problem with also very, very intelligent and smart people, yeah, uh, is that they, in the background, there is this presumption of the presumption that the mental consciousness is the ultimate tool for knowledge.
Mhm.
If you are able to rationalize, especially with mathematics, with science, with empiricism, yeah, drag down everything into this paradigm, that's the ultimate nature of things. And even better, if you can reduce it to particles, molecules, neurons, and things like that, yeah, genes. And that's so deeply rooted in our mentality, this mental, intellectual, analytic, reductionist way of conceiving and perceiving life that has rooted itself yeah, in our neurons to such a degree that it is really difficult for, as I see this continues for a lot of people, to get away from. For example, when we explain illness in terms of biochemicals, molecules, and genes and cells, that has much more convincing power for people than taking perhaps an integral psychological perspective and say, perhaps the origin of your illness has also psychological. People understand this. Nowadays, science accepts the fact that there is the so-called placebo effect, that the mind has some power on the body. But if you explain things in like that, people say, yeah, I know, we know that, but you must reduce it to the interaction of molecules and neurons. Then they say, then people feel that it has been explained away, yeah? Which is not true at all, because we don't know what is the cause and what is the effect. Yeah?
Yeah, I actually, I remember the first book that I read that had to do with spirituality was Hermann Hesse, Siddhartha.
Siddhartha,
And
yeah.
I remember this little piece of the conversation between the Buddha and and Siddhartha, in which Siddhartha poses a very complex, intelligent question about spirituality and enlightenment and all that. I don't even remember exactly what it was. And the Buddha's answer to it was, beware of too much intelligence.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah, yeah.
And when I was studying Buddhism, I learned that actually intelligence is one of the causes of illusoriness. The more intelligent people are capable of creating and fabricating more and more illusions, you know.
Illusions. Ah, okay.
Yeah, yeah, because
Yeah, yeah.
because you know, I mean, Marco, this is a whole different conversation. I think we need to maybe have another, maybe at some point, if we're interested, have a different conversation about, what we call laws of nature. What
Yeah.
are these laws of nature, and how we understand nature,
Did you
and how
see the
much.
last on my YouTube channel? I had a discussion, a conversation with exactly about this topic with Don Salman.
I actually started looking at it, but I haven't finished
Take a
it yet.
look. Take a look.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But what I was going to say is that, um, the way that everything works that we would like to know, and if we call it reality and say we'd like to discover what reality is, the way we're going about it right now is through our mental intelligence.
Yeah.
And everything that we know is basically maps and cognitive things that we have created, from subatomic particles to chemistry and so many different things that, we actually have no direct experience of, that we are just looking at it through different machinery, for example, looking at subatomic particles colliding in the hadron, collider, and we can graph and see all these
Yeah.
things and so on. But all these things are still creations of our own mind.
Yeah. Exactly.
Reality works because it works anyway, independent of human intelligence. You see, it's not that we create a law and it makes things work. It's just that we approximate some kind of a mental um, picture, that through which we can explain why something works in the way that we see it works. And then we think that it's because of this map. This map is just
Yeah.
secondary. It has nothing to do with how nature works. So I think, again, another piece of integral consciousness is to really get over this over tendency to look at everything from mental perspective and from this level of intelligence, that we need to really go to these higher levels of consciousness that Sri Aurobindo has enumerated, and especially
Mhm.
intuitive consciousness, and try to really see the bigger picture, because we really don't know reality, and things will work even if we don't know how they work, because the reality and what makes them work is not us humans. So we need to become more detached from how we think things work, and all these theories. I mean, there's not a single theory of science that has not been improved on or totally refuted, and or whole new theory has been developed about the same phenomenon. You see, uh,
Yeah.
the success that we see at the engineering and technology level is a different matter. Is not a theoretical thing. It's because we've found ways of making these things work. But our theoretical knowledge is something that is our self-creation. And so I think we need to become aware of these different levels of consciousness. And so besides the soul, there's also the problem of dealing with these types of intelligence that are causing the issues.
Yeah. I think one thing also is by going beyond a strictly mentalistic approach, beyond this mental consciousness, this develops also more discrimination. Because what we lack nowadays, also very smart people, perhaps precisely because they are smart, they are intelligent, yeah. So a lot of them lack sometimes discrimination. They put things together and they are not aware that they are doing that, yeah. And I already mentioned, for example, this conflation of mind and consciousness. Mind and consciousness, for me, complete. So it's like an elephant and a mouse.
Yeah,
But why? Why do I this? It's not because of a mental rumination. because I take a first-person perspective. I go inwards and see that there is something, they are two completely different things. But also high-ranking philosophy professors, they don't understand what I'm talking about. Not all, but and also it's this on and off thinking, yeah, also sometimes this black and white thinking. Just recently, I saw someone who was asking whether nematode, it's a sort of worm. It moves around, it prays, it does, it thinks, it lives, and everything indicates that there is a perception, that there's a sort of proto-cognition. And if he was asking, is this thing conscious? Yeah.
Mm.
But rarely these Western scientists who are not at all interested in all this metaphysics and spirituality and integral yoga, it's new, it's woo-woo. No? Then rarely ask themselves, maybe consciousness is not a switch that you turn on and off. There are several degrees, levels of consciousness. Maybe this single-celled organism is not conscious like a human being, but maybe there is a sort of proto-consciousness, of minimal consciousness, so to speak.
Yeah,
No,
often
no,
self-consciousness is confused with consciousness. You know, self-consciousness is
self, by the way, this is also another chapter. I saw a lot of people who say self-consciousness, when someone is able to recognize oneself in a mirror, that is self-consciousness and equated with consciousness. Maybe I'm not intelligent enough in recognizing myself in the mirror, but I might be a being, a sentient being who has some form of consciousness. But all these conflations, everything is put into the same pot, mixed together, and then they build upon this castle, a theoretical castle, that obviously then has always some internal contradiction. It leads to some inconsistencies, and they then wonder why. And another thing that came to my mind, what you were previously saying, there was a point where psychology is Freud, I think, no? Saw everything from the point of view of sexuality. Then everything became sexualized. Then there was a shift towards power. Everything was explained away in terms of power. Then Maslow came and spoke about the role of self-actualization. Then everything can be explained away. What we must develop is this integral view, where all these aspects have a truth, have their place.
yes.
It's not that they are wrong or right, that they have their place in a specific context, and we must be able to see all these contexts all together and reach this what you call the quest for wholeness. I like.
Yes.
I love this expression.
No, I think that's a very good summary, you know, of a lot of things that we talked about, and I totally agree with that. You know, all these different perspectives, all these levels of consciousness exist, but still there's something that can see it all at once. And I think that is exactly what we're after here. And it's not mental, and it's not about intelligence, and it's not about the physical, and it's not about the spiritual. It's just something that is over and above and beyond all of these, and it includes all of these levels of consciousness. Yeah. Thanks, Marco. That was a good way of capping that.
Yeah, okay. So I think we can also wrap it up. Huh? And how many this is the third session we had. I can say also we can conclude this chapter on integral psychology.
Yeah, yeah. I think, there's a lot of other things that falls
Yeah,
into it, but those would be uh, either more technical or more
yeah,
detailed, or has to do with the relationship of integral psychology with other fields and so many different things. But I think in all these conversations we've had several by now, we've touched on some of these main issues. I doubt that we've left any one aspect that is so crucial that we
yeah.
haven't covered. But yeah, I feel very satisfied and just a lot of good uh, refreshers for me as well, because I usually don't think about all of these things within a short span of time, uh, or and having all the perspectives that you bring in, all the questions that you bring in is really key here as well. So
Bahman, can you eventually suggest some reading, some literature or book? Or, I mean, I already mentioned one of your articles. The other article I have here from, I don't know what is this, revision, um, is entitled of you, Wholeness, Integration of Personality and Conscious Evolution in Integral Psychology.
yeah,
In
I think that's a good.
revision, volume 32, number 1.
That would be a good small sort of article without getting in too many things. But I can, if you like, I can send you a few references, for reading if someone's interested in integral psychology, and then maybe you can put it in the description.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I will, all these articles that we mentioned now, I will put it in the description, and yeah, eventually also the stuff that you sent me per email, and so other who are eventually interested then can continue with this, hopefully. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so
Thank you very
much,
much,
Marco.
Bahman.
It's
Was a
been very, very
very,
nice.
very interesting and inspiring conversations.
All right. Well, we'll look forward to maybe some other interactions in the future.
Yeah,
Thank you so
eventually
much.
on other subjects eventually. Thank you. Have a nice time.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.